Before We Leave, developed by Balancing Monkey Games and published by Team 17, describes itself as a city-building game set in a cozy corner of the universe. That's only half true though, as there's no shortage of challenge and dangers, of a sort. Managing the logistics of a global, and, eventually, interplanetary civilization is no easy task. But what sets Before We Leave apart from its peers is the lack of a true fail state, and the ability to always come back from bad decisions. As an indie title, priced at only a third of what you'd pay for a big-budget release, Before We Leave places all its focus on the gameplay, and provides only a bare minimum of narrative context. All we know is that at some point in the distant past, humanity fled into bunkers to escape a cosmic threat. Generations later, they emerge above ground, having forgotten all but the most basic technology, or even the reason their ancestors fled below the surface in the first place. Now there is one scenario, think of a more tailored experience with distinct win criteria, that provides a little more insight into the past events, but that's about all you get. Outside of these 4 scenarios with specific win conditions, every other game mode is effectively endless and devoid of any story beats. Thankfully, the gameplay, which consists of juggling dozens of interconnected systems, will keep you fully engaged regardless. The tutorial should be the first thing you tackle, as it eases you into the flow of the early game, while immediately highlighting the complexities you'll face as your peep population grows and your fledgling colony expands first across continents and eventually across the solar system. The first issue you'll encounter is the fact that procedurally generated hex-based worlds are tiny. Each island offers up 1 or 2 biomes, which affects potential land use, and a limited number of natural and technological resources. As a result, moving up the tech tree, mining and refining new materials, or providing new luxuries to keep your peep population happy will always require expansion. You'll find enough resources on your starting island to always build ships to scout and colonize new islands, and from there you'll discover the resources and technology you need to get into space, and there discover even scarcer resources on new planets. It seems manageable at first, as most buildings only occupy a single hex, but then so too do the basic roads you need to connect every structure. Farms and water sources require fertile hexes, but clearing forests will limit your wood supply, decrease your peep's happiness, and remove a potential pollution sink for any nearby industrial buildings. Deserts, icy wastes, and rocky highlands often provide essential raw materials, but these areas limit food production. As a result, you'll need to constantly overhaul your early sprawl as your needs change and your technology advances, making for an incredibly busy and often iterative experience. The second major issue is establishing supply lines. Before We Leave has no ethereal resource pool to draw from. Each planet, and each island on a planet, generate its own stockpile of resources for construction, refining, and manufacturing. As a result, setting up supply lines, by boat, airship, or spaceship, quickly becomes an important gameplay element. Ensuring each island and planet is autonomous might seem like a good idea at first, but if you want to optimize and maximize production chains, you'll need to specialize each island, or entire planet, and establish dense supply lines between them. Assuming you've managed to expand your civilization off-world, optimize resource production, and establish these supply lines to keep your peeps happy, you'll still need to deal with several distinctly weird threats. Space whales that consume buildings and peeps along their path as they skim through the atmosphere, gremlins that steal resources unless you've invested in night lighting, and even minotaurs that scare your workforce back to their homes, if not first subdued by wrestlers. Despite all these complexities, these challenges are always surmountable, as Before We Leave rarely allows you to hit a dead end, and offers granular difficulty settings. As an example, most basic resources are abundant and never entirely consumed. Buildings can be demolished to retrieve rare resources for other structures, and your peeps simply slow down or stop working when hungry or unhappy, rather than die off. You'll also quickly discover there's always a technological solution to any challenge. Think more nutritious farm types, green power generation options that don't emit pollution, the automation of industries, and permanent solutions for several of these threats you'll tackle. With multiple overlays and tooltips to highlight any issues, the challenge rather comes from figuring out the optimal path forward if you become stuck, rather than having to start over. This design makes Before We Leave far more accessible than many games in the genre, but it also limits replayability. You'll soon realize the location of scarce resources is predictable, based on the chosen difficulty and the number of planets in the solar system. As a result, there's a limited number of randomness between runs, and replayability ultimately becomes about tackling larger solar systems and learning to optimize your early and mid-game build order. Now, there are the 4 aforementioned scenarios that offer novel challenges. Think abundant resources but time limits, city layout restrictions, or keeping an overpopulated civilization happy. But Before We Leave still lacks the dynamism of games with factions, diplomacy, and conflict. Visually, Before We Leave looks great and runs well on console. The environments and structures look distinctive and vibrant, while zooming out to see the entire solar system is undeniably cool. Unfortunately, the limited tile set becomes obvious the longer you play, and parts of the UI also feel more like stock assets. Perhaps more important is the audio, with a strong spatial component. Think shifting audio levels as you pan around or zoom in and out, immersive ambience, and a chilled soundtrack that encapsulates the vibe the developers envisioned. Navigating the world and menuing by gamepad feels good, though this was obviously a game first designed around mouse and keyboard. There are some issues with submenus that can often stay open and leave you wondering why your cursor is unresponsive and not selecting hexes. All things considered, Before We Leave is a solid indie city builder. It offers plenty of accessible content at a budget price. If you enjoy the thought of micromanaging a mini-civilization, without the potential for dead-end trajectories, it's well worth the price, and a no-brainer if you have an Xbox Game Pass sub. However, the longer you play, the more you'll recognize the rigid design and lack of dynamism seen in other games in the genre. That said, modern games can always grow over time with patches and expansions, which Before We Leave has already done on PC. So I'm looking forward to seeing what Balancing Monkey Games have planned in future updates.